Language and dialect. I'll start this presentation with a quote from Max Wenrich, who was a Jewish Latvian sociolinguist. He specialized in Yiddish. Language is a dialect with an army and a navy. What is language and what is dialect? Dialect is defined as mutually intelligible. For example, France French and Canadian French are both dialects of the same language because they are mutually intelligible. The French Canadians in general can understand the French from France and vice versa. However, two separate languages are not mutually intelligible. For example, French and Italian. Although there are similarities, French and Italian are separate languages because Italians cannot understand the French and the French cannot understand Italians. A dialect is a subordinate variety with geographical or social boundaries. Lexico-statistics. Lexico comes from lexicon, which refers to vocabulary. It's a method comparing speech of different speech communities to determine whether they are dialects of the same language or whether they are different languages. If 81 to 100% of the vocabulary is cognates, that would signify that they are dialects of the same language. If 28 to 80% of the words are cognates, then they are two separate languages and they're within the same word family. So for example, Italian and French would fall somewhere in between 28 and 80% cognates because they are separate languages, they're not mutually intelligible. However, they are both Latin-based languages and they're within the same word family. If there's less than 28% cognates, then they're, again, separate languages. However, they have more distant relationships. A dialect is a variety from another dialect. In essence, everyone speaks a dialect, or a certain variety of a language. Here are some dialectal differences: pronunciation, syntax, or grammar, and vocabulary. Here's an example between American English and British English. You have the word hot, and in British English you have the word hot. This is a difference in pronunciation. An example of some differences in grammar or syntax would be in American English, Jane had gotten used to it, where in British English they would say Jane had got used to it. Then there's vocabulary differences. In American English, you would say Sam took the elevator. In British English, you would say Sam took the lift. Linguistic diversity. In Melanesia, that region of the world indicated on the map, is one of the most linguistically diverse areas on Earth, with over 1,500 languages, of which 50% of those languages are found on the island of Papua New Guinea. And many of these languages have less than 500 speakers. Language families in Papua New Guinea are Austronesian and non-Austronesian, or Papuan. Language diversity of Papua New Guinea are often due to rugged nature of the terrain which creates physical barriers against human interaction. Also, this diversity may be tied to cultural attitudes, since language is tied to identity. language diversity. As in Papua New Guinea, geography does play a role in linguistic diversity. Geography alone does not explain diversity. A lot of people in one area, or people in isolation, does not always guarantee uniformity of language. An example of this would be urban social dialects, such as Ave, or African American Vernacular English, found in Chicago, also known as Ebonics. Nothing be wrong with the way I be talking. This is a valid dialect of American English and is not more or less correct than any other variety. Language identity. When speaking of language identity, I like to refer to Scandinavia, the Scandinavian languages. Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian. They're all dialects of one language. They have very similar grammar and common vocabulary. Only 10% of vocabulary is different. And if we refer back to our lexico-statistic method of comparing languages or dialects, if there is 80 to 100% cognates in vocabulary, they would be considered dialects. And here we have 90% of the vocabulary is cognates. Therefore, it would fall under, it would be a dialect of the same language. The writing systems of these Scandinavian languages. They're not written phonetically. They're all orthographically different, however they all have very similar pronunciations. And so how is this tied to language identity? Well, these orthographical differences are consciously exaggerated, just so that they are different from each other, because they all have the same pronunciations. In Danish, vad, Swedish, vad, and Norwegian, vad. The pronunciations are similar, however, they're consciously spelled differently so that it ties to identity. Another flip-flopped example of language and identity would be Mandarin and Cantonese, which are separate languages. Mandarin and Cantonese share the same writing system, however they are spoken differently. And this is the opposite situation for Scandinavian languages, as they are pronounced the same but have different writing systems. So in Mandarin, the word welcome is spelt the same as the word in Cantonese, however they have different pronunciations. Huan Ying and Fun Ying. Political and cultural implications involved with language. Danes understand the Swedes better than the Swedes understand the Danes. Now, why would this phenomenon exist? Why would this be? Well, Sweden is a larger country, a wealthier country, economically self-contained, and has more educational opportunities. So therefore, there's more of an incentive for Danes to understand Swedes than there are for Swedes to understand Danes. There's a similar situation in Laos and Thailand. Laotians understand the Thai better than Thai understand Laotians. And yet again, Thailand is a larger country, wealthier, economically self-contained, more educational opportunities. Therefore, Laotians have more of an incentive to understand the Thais than vice versa. Now the notion of standard language. What is standard language? Well, it's a superordinate variety. Standardization is often used when we talk about literacy. In literacy, we use a standard variety. Nationalism. With cultural and ethnic identity, we all like to refer back to this standard language. Dictionaries are a prime aid in teaching standard language, or a resource of the standard language. And when we teach language, we always teach the standard. And standardization creates a feeling of unity, and that's why we have a standard. But could I ask this question? Who speaks the standard? Does anyone speak the standard? Or is it more this language that people refer to for cultural and ethnic identity purposes? Or does everyone speak a variety? Accent versus dialect. Accent is pronunciation of a variety, different pronunciations. However, dialect is a variety from other dialects. And when we refer to dialect, we talk about pronunciation, syntax, and vocabulary. As I mentioned before, in the example between American and British English, for example, hot and hot, got and got, elevator and lift. Then there's this notion of received pronunciation, or RP, which is a speech variety used by educated people, and this is the standard English in Britain. But it's only spoken by two people, in reality, one of which is Daniel Jones, a phonetician. So go figure. One of the two people that speaks the standard is a phonetician, a linguist, essentially, and everyone else speaks a variety of this standard. Now there's register versus style. Register is a variation in language concerned with usage. Okay, it involves context and situation. It involves purpose, subject matter, the content of the message, and relationship between the speakers. So two lawyers will use the register of law, okay, and this involves the subject matter. Okay, they're talking about law, so they're going to use certain vocabulary. They're going to use a register of law. The register of religion, for example, our merciful Father in heaven, okay, involves purpose, religion, and prayer, okay, and also the content of the message to a certain extent. Then you have mother-in-law language in Aboriginal languages of Australia, which is a special way of speaking that men use when they address their mother-in-laws, and they actually have different vocabulary that they use when they speak with their mother-in-laws. Okay, so this involves the relationship between the speakers, men and their mother-in-laws. Style, on the other hand, shows a range from formal to informal speech, which may involve social context, the relationship between the interlocutors, social status, sex, and age. This might involve vocabulary differences. To choose the word choice, okay, word choice. The teacher distributed versus the teacher gave out. This may involve syntax, passive versus active, and passive voice always tends to be a little bit more formal than active voice. And then it may involve pronunciation, reading versus readin', and want to versus wanna. Speech communities. What is a speech community? It's a social group that claims a variety as their own and is distinctive from other varieties. They share a set of norms and rules for the use of their language. It can or cannot be the same language. So one person speaking English could still belong to a variety of different speech communities. Okay, myself, I I belong to the education teacher speech community. I belong to the linguist speech community. I belong to the speech community just amongst my friends. I belong to I work part-time in a hospital, so I also belong a part of that speech community. I work for the nutrition department, so that is also considered a speech community. There are boundaries between speech communities as a social construct, okay, for that purpose. And a speech community is established in terms of interactional norms as a social construct. So it's not only language, but it's also these interactional norms. Conventions of English speakers. One example would be silence is awkward, and we like to fill in the gaps with talk so that it becomes less awkward. This isn't true for other speech communities. In some speech communities, silence is a virtue. British stereotypes. In Britain, changeability in unpleasant weather is a serious topic, where in America it could be cliche. When you have nothing else to say, you talk about the weather. And that could be one of these topics to bring up in order to fill in those gaps of silence to avoid awkwardness. An American stereotype is that we show too much familiarity with strangers. We ask personal questions too quickly before even getting to know the person on a more basic level, and then we like to offer many compliments, which in American culture we accept, and then we like to deflect those compliments. Language plays a role in the transmission of language. Okay, so now we're talking about language, society, and reality. Okay, so how does language play a role in culture? Okay, the American linguist Bernard Lee Whorf claimed that we are prisoners to our own language. We are only able to see the world as our language allows us to see it. If we don't have it's this idea that if we don't have certain words in our language, if they don't exist, can we see those things? Do they exist in our reality? Do they exist in our worldview? So, in a sense, language helps us make sense of the world. We see the world as our language allows us to see it. So in English, there's no word for the German word Schadenfreude, which means happy about someone else's misfortune. Okay? If we don't have a word in English to express that, then what does that say about our view of the world, our sense of the world? The Germans may have a different sense of the world since they have a specific word for that. In French culture, bread is the staple of cuisine of any meal, and bread is very important in the culture. And they have a specific word for the squishy, doughy part in the middle of a baguette called la mie, la croûte et la mie. In English, we just say the squishy center of the bread. But the French have a specific word for that, and so that ties into the importance of bread in their culture. Papua New Guinean languages, they have the same word used for hair, feather, and fur. So in English and other languages, we distinguish between those three, but in the Papua New Guinean languages, they have just one word for all three of those. In Russian, mir can mean peace and world. So what does that say about their worldview? In Eskimo, they have several words for just snow. In English, maybe we have flurries, we have snow, we have blizzard. So it's about 3, but Eskimo have many, many more words for snow. Why? Because snow is so much more a part of their world and so much a part of their culture that it's necessary for them to have more words to describe snow. It all ties into their worldview. In Swedish, they make distinctions in kinship. Faster is the father's sister, and moster is the mother's sister. Where in English, we would just use the word aunt. And I know that Thai and Lao have make similar distinctions in kinship. Dirbo language, it's an Australian Aboriginal language of only 5 speakers, so it's becoming distinct, but they have a classification system. Bayi is a class that includes men, kangaroos, possums, bats, most snakes, and the moon, etc. So they just have this one class, this one word, which classifies all of those things into one. Why are they classified this way? What does that say about their culture, their sense of the world? I know that Thai and Lao also have similar classification systems. In Japanese, the concept of self depends on social relations. So they have 4 pronouns for I in Japanese, and they choose their pronoun for I depending on who they're speaking with, who their interlocutor is. In Anya Madana languages, it's an indigenous Australian language, there's 10 pronouns for we, depending on, yet again, social relations, as in Japanese with the word I. In French, they make gender distinctions when addressing people. Same in French, Italian. For example, we have tu es heureux when you address a male, meaning you're happy, or tu es heureuse to a female. And these distinctions are grammaticalized based on the endings of the words. In Finnish, there's no gender distinction in the third person singular. So he, she, him, her, hers, and his are all the same word. So they don't make this distinction in gender, and I know that it's the same for Lao. I'm going to leave you with this one last quote by Suzanne Romain, author of Language and Society, published in 2000. No language has a privileged view of the world as it really is. The world is not simply the way it is, but what we make of it through language.